Heart of Darkness from 2008, a moving and very personal film. Well, we're joined now from Washington by Josh Rushing, himself a 15-year veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. Josh, thanks for speaking to us on Rewind. Can you take us back to the moment in the film when you brought together Ken Shiel along with one of his victims? What was that moment like?
It was incredible, and it was unintentional in that moment. We had arrived in Vietnam a couple of days ahead of Ken, and we had interviewed Kong, a really emotional interview. When Ken came, he came, I believe, if I remember, it was like straight from the airport. That was my first time to meet him. You see it on camera, me shaking his hands. He gets out of the van. We had just planned let's just walk around a bit, see what you remember, kind of put you back in the place. And while doing that, Kong saw us and came over and started to inquire about, who Ken was and where he was during Vietnam. And it all started to unfold before our eyes in this really emotional moment that I would not have set up in such a way because of the emotions were so high, but we couldn't quite stop it. And then as the moment evolved, we saw it was getting to a point that we thought we probably should stop it and maybe try to come back to it later. Looking back on it, it's hard to believe it's been 10 years. It seems like yesterday, but I was also fairly new to journalism at that time. And I thought, well, I guess this is just what journalism is. Like, this must happen all the time. Now that I've been at Al Jazeera for over 13 years and I hosted the show Fault Lines, I realized, that was actually an extraordinary moment that happened.
And he really seemed to struggle, though, when you were questioning him. He struggled answering your questions. What do you think was going on through his head at the time?
I 100% believe that in order for Ken to continue to live his life, that he had made a very intentional choice to silo what had happened in Vietnam. He had the memories, but there was no way that he was going to engage with the morality of it. I had the sense that he feels like if he started to, even a bit, he might not be able to control the flood of emotions and guilt and everything else that would come with it. And I have to say, when we had the idea to try to find someone from Charlie Company to take back, we got the court records and we had all these names and social security numbers, and so we started contacting people. And an alarming number of those people had actually killed themselves. Another group of those people were just in terrible, terrible shape. We finally found one guy who said he would go, called us back a week later and said that his therapist said, absolutely no way, not a good idea. So we had given up on finding a soldier to take back with us, but we were still going to go do the story. The day before we left the country, Ken was kind of that one last number that we called, and he said he would go. And we were rather surprised. But after Vietnam, he had gone on to be a cop, and I think he had just completely walled off inside himself what he did there and what had happened there.
And at the time, he was only 19 years old, and he was clearly believing that he was just doing this. He was following orders. So, Josh, let me ask you this. As a former soldier yourself, how difficult is it when you're actually in the field and you're ordered to do something that you morally disagree with?
I think it's easy to sit back and judge that situation and think that you would act differently. But the reality of it is, when you go through boot camp, they really break down who you are. And they build you back up into this other thing. For me, it was this U.S. Marine. That was my identity. And so you had this kind of ultimate trust in your leadership that you're not going to be given orders that are illegal. And so, of course, you follow them. Then you take that person and put them in a place like Vietnam, where everything you ever learned about a moral compass seems to be thrown out of the window there. And so you lose a sense of what's right and what's wrong in that kind of environment. And yeah, you end up following orders. But I still think there's that bit of humanity in you that says that this isn't right. In the court documents with Ken, someone testified that they saw him firing into a crowd of civilians while saying, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. So clearly he was struggling with it. In my own past, nothing as grave as what Ken faced, but the way that the Iraq War was sold and the way I was used to help sell it is something that I would not do today. But the thing about war is we send young people to fight these wars who don't have the wisdom that we gain as older people. You know, there's a reason that it's not a bunch of 40 and 50-year-olds fighting wars. The entire Marine Corps is 172,000 people. And if you take the average age, including all the 4-star generals in the Marine Corps, the average age is still just over 20 years old. That's how many young people at the bottom of that pyramid. And now at my age, 45, looking back at a 19-year-old kid, that is a child. And yet we give them weapons and put them in the most complex situations you can imagine and have them make life and death decisions. And then sit back and morally judge them for doing so.
And speaking of looking back, can you look back for me then to the My Lai Massacre and tell us what lessons can be learned from that?
It's a great question about lessons to be learned. You know, the My Lai Massacre, it didn't even get reported or come out for a couple years. It only came out because one soldier talked to another soldier that eventually talked to a young reporter named Seymour Hersh, and it came out. I think a lot of the, you know, that kind of warfare, go in and kill everything that moves is not effective, it's not legal, it's not morally correct. I think we know that now, but war seems to repeat itself. I mean, the lesson to me is, it's not a good lesson. The lesson I learned is that we send young people to war who do these things. The ones who survive, and I'll make a side note here, there actually are no survivors. The village of My Lai wasn't even named My Lai, it was named something else. My Lai was a misnomer on an American map. So that original village name didn't survive. No one really survived in the village that day. Kong is a completely different human than he was before that happened, and that shaped who he ended up becoming. The soldiers that we tried to get to go, none of them really survived either. The ones who didn't kill themselves, they weren't really complete pictures of human beings that they would have wanted to be. But those who do survive war and get old enough to realize its atrocities and how wrong it is, it's already too late, because the next generation of young kids, well, they're already there fighting the next one.
You're a former soldier, Josh, as we're saying. What was it like for you to go back to one of the U.S. Army's greatest disgrace?
Yeah, it was really personal. There wasn't a separation that there might be for another reporter in that situation. I mean, in every moment, I was wondering, what would I have done? And that was, you know, not long after I came out of the Marine Corps, and I'd been quite public about my regret for the role that I served as a spokesperson going into the Iraq War and how I felt like I'd been used to sell that war. I did another special for Al Jazeera called the Selling of War, so that I could kind of in some way find atonement to say, here's how war is sold, here are the things you should look for, here's what I did. And I did that so maybe that we could learn the lessons of not buying into war so much or so easily in the future. But in dealing with my own feelings about that, I had a sort of empathy for Ken, even though what I did and what I went through was nowhere on the par with his experience. But I had an empathy and a very kind of personal curiosity. What would I have done in My Lai? I like to think I've done the right thing, but I don't know. I will say there were heroes to come out of My Lai as well. My Lai was stopped by an American officer, warrant officer, Hugh Thompson, who literally lowered his helicopter in between Americans who were firing machine guns into the crowd of civilians, of Vietnamese. And he told his door gunner on that helicopter that if they didn't stop fire, the Americans, to open fire on them. And that would have been the only case I've ever known of U.S. troops intentionally firing on each other. But that's the level it was that to stop what he witnessed that day. Hugh Thompson and his crew, I mean, they were heroes to come out of that.
And what are you hearing about some of the victims' families now, years after this massacre took place? How are they coping?
So I haven't talked to Kong since then, but I can tell you the next day when I ran into him, he said he'd been up drinking all night at the grave of his relatives. And he told them that he was sorry that he had met the very man that may have killed them, and yet he couldn't avenge their deaths. He couldn't kick them or hit them or kill them because he represents the government of Vietnam, and they have a different policy now. But I mean, he was absolutely wrecked by it. We met another survivor who had returned the day we were there just by chance, and she found her home still standing, and she was emotionally destroyed by it. I mean, it's like I said, there really were no survivors from that awful day.
Josh Rushing, thank you for speaking to us at Rewind.
Thank you for having me.